You know, if we're honest with ourselves, loneliness is not just a private shadow we endure behind closed doors. It's a quiet fissure running through the heart of our communities, a fracture in the trust that binds us to one another. Most people overlook this, the way technology can promise connection but deliver isolation, how the rush of progress can leave someone unseen in a crowded room, unheard in a noisy world. We celebrate innovation, but what good is it if it deepens our solitude? If it erodes the bonds we rely on to sustain empathy, to sustain democracy itself? And so I wonder, in a time when screens light up our faces but dim the warmth between us, how do we reclaim the spaces for human connection before the silence becomes permanent? In the early 21st century, as smartphones became extensions of our hands and social media feeds shaped our lives, we witnessed an irony. We were closer in data, but farther apart in presence. Families drifted from the simple rituals of shared meals, neighborhoods became lines on a map rather than living communities, and people struggled quietly, carrying invisible burdens of depression, anxiety, and disconnection. There were moments when national conversations began to stir, a summit here, a policy initiative there, acknowledging mental health as not merely a private struggle, but a societal concern. Advocates spoke openly, parents pushed against stigma, and slowly the notion of loneliness as a public issue began to take root. Yet, even as awareness grew, the challenge remained human: how to balance our freedoms, our drive for individuality, with the moral responsibility we owe to one another to ensure no one is left behind in the quiet shadows. I think back to my own life and I realize how familiar that tension is. When I was organizing in Chicago, walking the neighborhoods and knocking on doors, I learned that people often feel invisible even in their own communities. And uh, later in the White House, the weight of isolation was something I felt personally too: the responsibility of the office, the scrutiny, the constant negotiation between ambition and restraint, between private grief and public duty. But what struck me most, time and again, was witnessing ordinary people reaching out despite their own struggles. Families caring for relatives with mental illness, neighbors checking in on one another, volunteers building bridges where institutions had failed. There's a quiet heroism in that, a reminder that the fabric of society is stitched not only by policy, but by presence, by the simple act of noticing, of extending one's hand before the loneliness becomes permanent. And I can't help but smile, remembering that even a president, in moments of doubt and exhaustion, is reminded by these ordinary acts of care that we are, in truth, connected in ways screens cannot fully measure. And here is the deeper truth we often forget: loneliness is not merely absence of company, it is the absence of attention, the absence of empathy, the absence of shared responsibility. It tells us something essential about human nature, about democracy itself. A society that tolerates invisible suffering without response risks weakening its own foundations. The paradox is, striking freedom allows us to innovate, to pursue individual dreams, yet without care, that very freedom can become a vector for isolation, eroding the collective trust that democracy demands. Leadership, then, is tested not only in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, persistent call to lift one another, to name suffering when it is convenient to look away. Hope, in this context, is not naive, it is deliberate. It is the patient work of creating spaces where people can reconnect, where communities can bear witness to each other's struggles, and in doing so, reclaim a sense of shared strength. So we are left with a question that is at once simple and profound. What does it take to rebuild the connections that sustain us? It takes courage to reach across divides, to sit with discomfort, to speak the truth about our own vulnerabilities. It takes a recognition that no policy, no technology, no well intentioned program can substitute for presence, for listening, for the patient labor of human engagement. And it takes faith in ordinary people, in families, in neighborhoods, that even in the face of a society bent toward isolation, empathy can prevail. The arc of connection, like the arc of justice, bends slowly, but when guided by intention, by the insistence that no one should suffer in silence, it bends toward hope. Can we, in our daily lives, cultivate the patience and the commitment to reach out before the fractures deepen? Can we honor the invisible battles of those around us by offering not judgment, but attention and care? And in the end, when we consider the world we are leaving to our children, will we have nurtured a society where loneliness is met not with resignation, but with relentless human presence? Because in the quiet, when the screens are dark and the crowd disperses, that is the measure of our humanity, not in our innovations, not in our achievements, but in the way we stand with each other, lifting those who cannot lift themselves, speaking when others are silent, and proving day by day that no one heals alone. The arc of connection bends toward hope if we choose it. The question is, do we have the patience to keep bending it? Do we have the courage to notice the unseen, to speak the unspoken, and to act when the world tempts us to look away? And ultimately, will we remember that the strength of a society is not counted in wealth or technology or power, but in the tender, persistent work of being present for one another?